name is Sonia Riang. I am a Chow Professor of Asian Studies here.
Louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a Professor of Asian Studies here. My name is Sonia Riang. I used to be Chow Center Director, and that's when we had Professor Brianne Donaldson as, you were the first, weren't you? First Jain.
Oh,
yes. And I'm going to read her title. She has a long title, but before that, I just want to share a little bit of a personal the saga, or not so much.
Saga.
Well, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about that. But Brianne was a very popular teacher here. Her courses on Jainism, nonviolence, and human-animal connections, and bioethics was just so well received. She stayed here, she taught here for 3 years. And her courses will fill, and then there'll be long wait lists. And yes, we miss her so much. But now, she is, Dr. Donaldson is Sri Harshvardhan, Presidential Chair in Jain Studies and Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religious Studies in University of California, Irvine. And she's the author and editor of 6 books, including Insistent Life, Principles for Bioethics in the Jain Tradition, which was published by University of California Press in 2021. I'm sure, I can assure you, maybe a couple, if not more, books are already in pipeline, given your productivity. So today's talk by Dr. Donaldson is entitled, it's already here, but anyway, Multispecies Solidarity and Nonviolence in Jain Practices of Unselfing. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brianne Donaldson. We have 45 people who are participating in this webinar through Zoom. Just
Yeah. All right. With the virtual crowd.
Yes.
Thanks to the Department of Transnational Asian Studies here at Rice, Sonia especially, Lisa wherever she is, Hei-Hun and Amber online making this happen, Maya, Bryson, Jeff Kreipel, so good to see you here. Thanks for making the time. My 3 years here at Rice were so formative, and I really have so many people to thank, and at least a few of them are here today, so thank you. Contemporary political debates diverge on whether multi-species solidarity can occur with or only on behalf of more than human beings. Now, in order to help bring this debate to life, Maya gave you all a handout. And I want to note that at present there are 92 endangered or threatened species in and around Harris County, where we're at today in Texas, according to the Texas Conservation Action Plan. And that includes plants, land animals, birds, and aquatic mammals, many of which are listed on this handout that you have. Both the endangered and the threatened groups receive some federal and state protections to prevent their annihilation. Now, at the same time, in any given month in the state of Texas, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture records, for just last November 2024, just a couple months ago, approximately 57.5 million animals were killed for cheap meat and dairy in a single month in this state, and the majority of those were chickens. Now, many people are surprised to learn that there are no federal laws for the treatment of meat and dairy animals, and that most standard industry practices would be considered a felony if they were done to a dog or a cat. So I want to get you involved for this time by asking you to first choose one or more of these life forms on that handout that you have to hold in your imagination throughout our time. Maybe you can choose one from the threatened group of species, and then maybe the farmed animal community. You can add your own. But you can begin to think, if you wanted to advocate on behalf of any of these entities, or your chosen entities, can we do it with them, or only on behalf of them? Now, the South Asian concept of nonviolence, or ahiṃsā, notably developed within the wider metaphysical ethical system of the Jain tradition, challenges this either-or approach of solidarity and offers what I think is a promising third alternative, which is solidarity as other beings. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Advantage this part. Thanks. You just want this part gone? How's that look? Okay, great. So I think the Jain tradition offers us another alternative, which is solidarity as other beings, through practices that I'm calling unselfing, also identity merger, including rebirth, rebirth memory, and activities that decenter the self, which are missing in political accounts of Western modernity that persistently presume the subject-centric I think, therefore I am of Descartes and many others following as their ontological and their epistemic ground. So we can just get into it straight away. Contemporary solidarity studies often revolve around whether political solidarity can actually take place directly with or only on behalf of more than human beings. And we'll start with political theorist Sally Schultz, who distinguishes two kinds of solidarity. The first, social solidarity, Schultz says, is possible with any kind of connectivity, relation, or shared vulnerability, including with more than human beings. But according to Schultz, the second kind of political solidarity is primarily a human endeavor that can, quote, take place only on behalf of more than human beings, since such entities lack cognitive and communicative capacities that enable them to form subjective commitments, share a goal, or recognize a strategic group unity, end quote. Political solidarity is, according to Schultz, quote, a human relation against an injustice that is human in origin, end quote. And as such, it requires a kind of ego-directed communication, goals, and unity, and for Schultz, it can only then take place on behalf of more than human beings, but not fully with them. Now, an alternate perspective comes from Kyone Mallory, offering an alternative to this view, and Mallory utilizes ecofeminist Val Plumwood, who maybe some of you have had the opportunity to read. Rooted in Plumwood's experience of being prey, after she was attacked by a crocodile while canoeing in the Australian outback, Plumwood underwent what she calls a shocking reduction of human exceptionalism. So oftentimes when we think about animal rights, we're thinking about having some kind of door through which, of capacities, whether that be language or reason or a multiplicity of capacities, by which you would bring up more than human beings to the level of the human. And what Plumwood is saying here is not at all looking that direction. She's saying that in the experience of being prey, she underwent a shocking reduction of human exceptionalism. She said, quote, from a complex human being to a mere piece of meat, end quote. And from this experience, Plumwood suggests that more than human solidarity cannot be defined in, quote, exclusionary and human-centered ways, wherein the so-called human is uncritically presumed to be a distinct natural kind possessing rationality, language, and communication, while also providing an illusory sense of invulnerability, end quote. So releasing this stable sense of the human permits what Plumwood calls standing with the other in a supportive relationship. So Mallory offers Plumwood's view as a fundamental challenge to Schultz's sense of political solidarity only by and for humans. Now, if you return to your worksheet and to the circled forms that you've chosen here, Schultz is going to say that these beings can only be with you if they are like you in communication, goals, and participatory unity. But for Mallory's dissent, Plumwood's shocking reduction exposes the illusion of a fixed human, or really any fixed species or language categories that fundamentally separate people from more than human beings. Instead, for Mallory, by way of Plumwood, political solidarity emerges just by being present to, by being with another's specificity, not their group identity, right? By being in the moment with the particularity. Not shared capacities that belong to a particular group, but any given moment and the capacities, exposures, and communications that emerge right then and there. That's how one is with. Now, for the rest of my time, I want to briefly explain possible foundations for considering more than human solidarity in the Jain tradition, and spend a little bit more time on what I see as a third alternative from these two perspectives. So solidarity is not a technical term in the Jain canon. But for over 2,500 years, practitioners have attempted to coexist less violently with a universe overflowing with sentient life. This less violent ideal is featured in one of the most elaborate symbols in the Jain aesthetics called the samavasram, meaning the coming together, the gathering. It's both an architectural design, it's also understood to be a social assembly of people, gods, animals, and it occurs whenever one of the 24 illumined Jain teachers, called a jinna, and it's from that word jinna that the word Jain derives, whenever one of these jinnas attain omni-perception of the universe, called kevalyan, perceiving all of the universe in a single moment as its substances, qualities, and modes are changing moment to moment. That's that omni-perception. And this gathering is the communication of all of that knowledge and the fundamental principle of ahiṃsā to all gathered according to their ability to receive it. And I just wanted to put a couple other really beautiful images of this here. Could we shrink that down? Can you just shrink that down so there's not so many? Thank you so much. So this one here, beautiful, more of a kind of statue in Belgium, and this one I took a picture last summer in Dubai, and it's like a mobile. You can move it as part of rituals into different communities. So the aim of multi-species nonviolence is also embodied in many actions. Seen in some of these iconic images of Jain monks and nuns. You can see in the Shvetambara tradition wearing mouth shields to prevent disturbing airborne organisms, walking barefoot, eschewing all mechanized transportation so as not to injure invisible earth body beings, using hand brooms to sweep the ground when they're walking, sitting, or laying down, eating once daily simple vegetarian food prepared by others that is further free of root vegetables and certain other high seed plants due to the high number of lives that are impacted in their harvest. Now, of course, the majority of lay Jains are not monks and nuns. In fact, there have been many Jains who have graduated and come to school here in campus. The community within Houston that has sponsored this lectureship today are not mendicants, they're just lay Jains. But they too strive to reduce harms in the context of their work, family, and home life. And I want to think about three possible foundations for considering solidarity in the Jain view. And I'll just say a quick word back to this previous slide. Sonia had mentioned this book. I actually started the research while I was here at Rice for this co-authored book on bioethics. So it was just a good feeling about that connection with Rice. But the reason I even began to think about solidarity was because I was invited by a group of European critical animal study scholars to say, with these practices that we just looked at, that are part and parcel of the Jain tradition, there must be some account of solidarity. And so it made me think, what are the possible foundations? And so that just came out last year. And then actually just in a couple of weeks, Knowing Life, the Ethics of Multispecies Epistemologies, is an edited collection, but we're looking at cross-cultural perspectives beyond the standard dominant forms of knowing for multi-species communication. So some upcoming projects that I keep digging into here. I think there's a lot to find. So three possible foundations I want to look at. The first is that Jain cosmology, which emphasizes universal sentience with karmic difference, offers a foundation for solidarity with other beings. Universal sentience comes through the Jaina metaphysical affirmation that the universe is packed with infinite jivs. And jiv is this core life force that'll within all existing entities. Every jiv will be born into one of four birth states: human, plant or animal, heavenly being, or hell being. These are all karmic understood to be karmic determined birth states. And here again, I would invite you to look at your worksheet, to look at your circled life forms, and you can consider it, you can try on this idea for the next hour, consider this as a jiva, this core life force in the Jain view. And each jiva is understood to have 4 dominant qualities. The first is pure consciousness, which has 2 facets of pure knowledge and pure perception. Pure energy, which enlivens perception and knowledge, and then pure bliss, which in our common use means something different than what its technical use is in the Jain tradition, which is more of the degree to which a jiva focuses inward rather than outward. Each of these jivas, and think about this through your worksheet, it's considered its own individual ultimate on a unique path across possibly hundreds of thousands of births, deaths, and rebirths, known as samsara. And it provides a radical point of ontological equality for every existent being. But every jiva is also existing in a different embodied mode, just like on your worksheet. And this is due to its accrued karma. And I can imagine all of you have heard, some of you heard of this term karma, right? And it's within South Asia, there's a number of meanings of karma. And the Jain tradition systematizes karma really more than any other Indic tradition, and considers it a kind of subtle matter that adheres to the jiva due to damaging attractions and aversions through any kind of thought, speech, or action. The root of karma is kar, meaning action. Every action has this attraction of a material substance to the jiva. It's understood to be the causal reason for differences in each jiva's innate qualities, and also the kind of body, life duration, and environment that it will be born into. And this includes not just the 4 birth states that I referred to, but also the number of senses through which an embodied jiva will experience the world from 1 to 5. And we've got just a really beautiful manuscript image here of 5-sensed animals, which includes all mammals, birds, fish, and also 5-sensed people are all considered to be 5-sensed beings. And some of those also have a mind. In total, the Jain texts describe 8.4 million possible birth forms that a jiva can inhabit, meaning that any given jiva will likely experience rebirth in hundreds of thousands of life forms, including any of those on your handout. While these different forms are karmically conditioned, those qualities of pure knowledge, perception, energy, and bliss are never absent, though they're said to be more or less obstructed in particular rebirths. So let's switch now to reciprocal suffering and the response of carefulness as another possible foundation. The recognition that harming others results in harm to oneself offers a foundation for solidarity on behalf of other beings. Jain teachings assert that existence in samsara is extremely difficult. It's characterized by immense physical and psychic suffering. Moreover, embodied existence in Jain view requires trespass on other living beings, since to sustain any kind of body means to participate in 4 instincts, or samyas, in early Jain texts, which is craving for food, which leads to fear, desire for reproduction, and accumulation of things for future use. And these 4 instincts are understood to be the embodied roots of violence, or ahiṃsā. And we can see this recognition of shared suffering even with plants and one-sense elemental life, noted in various Jain texts, including this one from the Acharanga Sutra, which is a mendicant text in the Shvetambara tradition. And I wonder if maybe to get a break from me, would someone be willing to channel your ancient Jain text and give us this text box? Yeah, no, go for it. Maya, you're on deck. You get this next time.
As the nature of this, i.e. men, is to be born and to grow old, so is the nature of that, i.e. plants, to be born and to grow old. As this has reason, so that has reason. As this falls sick when cut, so that falls sick when cut. As this needs food, so that needs food. As this will decay, so that will decay. As this takes increment, so that takes increment. As this is changing, so that is changing.
Thank you. So as I said, the Jain concept of karma, which derives from the Sanskrit root kar, meaning action, emerges from this very realist affirmation that embodied life always has a cost, not just to the recipients of action, but also to the actor themselves. So that as Jain scholar Christy Wiley says, the spiritual well-being of a person is tied to the physical well-being of all forms of life. Right? The physical well-being of all forms of life. And this reciprocal sense of mutual harm, but also mutual flourishing, is an essential feature of Jain nonviolence in the context of solidarity. Since when one harms, torments, or kills another living being, they are doing the same karmically to themselves, ensuring difficulties in this life and in possible future rebirths. Now, the recognition that all living beings are vulnerable to suffering, even those whose pain is difficult to observe, like those plants that we just read about. This also includes living beings in earth, air, fire, water, and wind, these one-sense beings, which early texts say are very difficult to see. But they also explain some of those practices that we saw with the mendicants, right? To wear the mouth shield, to sweep the ground clear. Even when something can't be seen, we're not in empty space, according to Jain metaphysics. And this motivates Jains towards stringent practices of carefulness. And I've got the word here, the Sanskrit apramata, which is a technical and frequently used term throughout early Jain texts that describes practices for anticipating living beings everywhere. And it's juxtaposed with its opposite, carelessness, pramata. But this carefulness provides specific practices to support the wider vows of nonviolence for which the Jain tradition is known. So the first is nonviolence, the second is truth, non-stealing, chastity or bodily control, and non-accumulation of goods. But those are somewhat general, and so many other practices help to give specificity to these vows. And we can see an example here in what we call the 5 sammitis, translating really as the 5 carefulnesses. And I would just invite you to think of if and how you might have practiced any of these this week, or how you might think about them or practice them in the days to come. The first is, and we can remember that these are originally for mendicants, but of course lay Jains also now will strive to at least consider how they could embody these. Carefulness in walking, carefulness in speaking only when needed, and either with truth or to maintain silence. Carefulness when accepting food or gifts without extreme pleasure or greediness. Careful picking things up or setting them down just to avoid harming living beings, since we're not in empty space. And then again, for mendicants, carefulness in excretory functions, to choose a place with as few living beings as possible. Basically, these sammitis suggest that whatever a mendicant will do, and in fact whatever any of us would do, on a daily basis, walking, talking, consuming, that action can be done more or it can be done less carefully. And we can see in these practices of carefulness here, both a negative, do not do, but we also can see a positive movement toward acts of compassion that I think parallels views of solidarity on behalf of other living beings. So to move beyond this either-or dichotomy of multi-species solidarity, either with or on behalf of other living beings, I want to look at an alternative third option of solidarity as other beings. And to do this, I've turned to a Jain teaching story, which raises important issues on how one can stand in multiple identities simultaneously. We'll look at a text from the Uttarabhyanya Sutra, an early text said to include the final teachings of the 24th and the most recent Jain teacher called Mahavir, maybe dating to the 4th, 5th century BCE, according to current historical scholars. And this text describes a prince called Mrgaputra. And this prince is totally beloved of his parents and his wives. He is living a posh life of ease until one day he looks out a window and he sees a monk practicing restraints and self-control. And this startles the prince into a memory of his own previous life as a mendicant. And here we can actually hear a kind of echo with the Buddhist tradition. If any of you know the story of the prince who comes out of his own life of ease and has the 4 visions of a sick person, a dying person, and a dead person, and also a meditating monk. And we know, of course, that these Indian traditions, along with Islam and the Sikh tradition, began to really communicate and interpenetrate and inform one another throughout the centuries of South Asian thought. So Prince Bhargaputra, recalling his past dedication to the Jain vows and his profound knowledge of the suffering of samsara, he tries to convince his parents to let him leave the house, let him pursue the mendicant path, and he does this by describing the terrible experiences that he had in previous lives, including both when his own Jeev was reborn as a hell being because of his own carelessness and cruelty toward others, but also has rebirth as animals, plants, and even iron. And here I thought we could also have some readers. So Maya, would you read the first couple for us?
Yes. As an antelope, I have, against my will, been caught, bound, and fastened in snares and traps, and frequently I have been killed.
Good. And let's give another one, Maya.
As a fish, I have, against my will, been caught with hooks and in bow nets. I have therein been scraped, slit, and killed an infinite number of times.
Good. Anyone want to talk about a bird? Let's get another voice out there. Read a little section for us. Bryson, wonderful.
As a bird, I have been caught by hawks, trapped in nests, and bound with bird line, and I have been killed an infinite number of times.
Go for it.
As a tree, I have been felled, slit, sawn into planks, and stripped of the bark by carpenters with axes, hatchets, an infinite number of times.
Good. And I'll pick up again here. As iron, I have been cut, torn, and filed by blacksmiths an infinite number of times, always frightened, trembling, distressed, and suffering. I have experienced the most exquisite pain and misery. In every kind of existence, I have undergone suffering which was not interrupted by a moment's reprieve. Though only the most advanced beings, such as liberated jinnas, are said to recall all their previous rebirths, many Jain stories do depict everyday, ordinary people, even heretics, recalling one or several of their previous past lives, which can provide and functions rhetorically as a shocking reminder of one's need for correct understanding of the living universe. Now, I invite you even to plug in your chosen life forms to these sort of visceral meditations of trying to imagine yourself into the experience of another, which in fact is even more applicable today within industrialization to billions of living beings who are caught in slaughterhouses, laboratories, fishing boats, clear-cutting, and even in danger through other justified uses of our fellow kin. So Bhargaputra is directly recalling the shocking reduction, in a way, of humanistic privilege that comes from being prey, similar to plumwood, due to his interchangeability with others through rebirth. He is not learning about other beings as objects over there, nor is he only seeing analogous similarities with his own, both of which maintain the dual split of thinking self and thought object. Rather, the text says, I have been killed, he says. I have been caught, trapped, bound, slit, scraped, sawn, or cut. The experiential interchangeability of rebirth described in Prince's narrative meaningfully complicates Plumwood's concern over human centrism and the ethics of sameness. On one hand, the prince's experience of being prey aligns very much with Plumwood's view of the other as not reducible to only taxonomic and species categories, all crocodiles, or all humans as such. The prince is recalling his singular Jeev inhabiting the body of this antelope, right? This bird, not all antelopes and all birds. But at the same time, this story sidesteps one of Plumwood's critical concerns, that solidarity should require, quote, sensitivity to the difference between positioning oneself with the other, which Plumwood advocates, and the non-desirable positioning oneself as the other, end quote. Plumwood wants to resist any kind of identity conflation as its own kind of violence. But this rebirth narrative that you all just read is exactly doing that. It is making that conflation. In the prince's story, one is with other living beings as individual Jeeves in the temporal present, in the same way as we're all here in the same room right now. But also, one's jiva indeed exists as other bodies in the temporal past and likely in the future to come, as a result of karma that's coming to fruition, providing a different but an equally shocking experiential insight into solidarity with, on behalf of, and as simultaneously. So the prince's narrative of identity merging invites us beyond the separative and the dualist, I think, therefore I am, toward diffused subjectivities that disclose not only the recognition of multiplicity and otherness from the outside, as Plumwood also meaningfully does in the encounter with the crocodile, but the prince narrates an experience of absorption and identification with other life from the inside, allowing perceptive contact beyond subject-centric modes of knowing that characterize Euro-Western modernity. This experience of identity merger through direct contact undermines the subject-centric turns which forms the ontological and epistemic ground that's elevated in Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But also the subjective turn in Immanuel Kant's respect for rational thinking persons, even George Berkeley's correlationism, where things can't exist without first being thought by a subject. So we have to ask, how is it that merely thinking about an object has come to be viewed as sufficient for valid knowledge of that object? And here I think we have to revisit some persistent cross-cultural challenges to this subjective turn, which has limited knowing to thought alone within Western modernity. We can look even to the margins of Western thought itself, to Bertrand Russell's, also later William James, philosophical distinction between knowledge by description on the one hand, meaning thought, language, and also knowledge by acquaintance. And many scholars class mysticism or identity merger or unselfing as part of the latter form of unmediated knowing. We can look to the Hindu mystic Sri Aurobindo, who in the early 20th century noted 4 cognitive methods of nature, including what he calls knowledge by identity, which is clearly of a different non-dual order, more of an unknowing, rooted in an unselfing experience. We can look to Howard Thurman, the Black philosopher, Christian mystic, inspired so much by Asian philosophies toward civil rights, who affirmed the all-enveloping divine spirit as a common ground for interior contact with anything that exists. And from there, Thurman would say that this enables outward action toward justice for the socially disinherited. The renouncing of self is also a key aspect of French feminist Simone Weil and a later, more contemporary Iris Murdoch, who both emphasize the ethical practice of attention. For Weil, to offer attention as a mode of witnessing the reality of another, she writes, quote, "The eye has to be passive. Attention alone, that attention which is so full that the eye disappears, is required of me." Put more strongly, Murdoch states that the, quote, "anxious and avaricious tentacles of the self are an illusion that veils the world and obscures attention to others." More recently, we even could point to secular queer theorist Judith Butler, who affirms the sociality that's masked within our common language that has to be acknowledged if we want to interrupt political violence. Butler writes in Precarious Life, "It's not as if an I exists independently over here and then simply loses a you over there, especially if the attachment to you is part of what composes who I am." And here again, I invite you to plug in your circled life form in terms of this I and you co-constitution. Losing the guardrails of a fixed self, of a separative I, is part and parcel of the long-existing figure of the mystic, so excluded from rational thought and dominant Western conceptions of the self, it's not lost on me that we have Jeff Feifel here in the audience too, who's spent most of your career thinking about mysticism. Asian traditions of yoga, of bhakti, tantra, siddha, Sufi, Jain, Sikh, Buddhist, Shaivite, Vaishnava, Shakta, to name but a few, they all offer what Sikh scholar Balbinder Singh Bogle calls a, quote, mystic turn, unquote, that precedes and exceeds the formation of the subject-centric I think of rational selfhood as the ontological and the epistemic ground of modernity. More importantly, these iterations of the mystic turn don't stop just at the important but still insufficient corrective of language or representation. If we look at Butler's deconstruction of the I and the you, now certainly this is much more deeply relational, yet her approach, which we can also see in affect theory, in animist theories, and in certain continental theories, that helpfully complicate the subject as a separate knower, right? All of these do that. But they still often maintain the subject-object duality that sustains egoic consciousness. It's only that further mystic turn of self-loss and identity merging through which the I think can be fundamentally challenged through an experience, however brief it might be, of mystic merger and the loss of separative self. Moreover, the experience of mystic merger often happens through activities, as emphasized in the Asian traditions of praxis, rather than the Abrahamic and Western emphasis often on theory, or the Greek theoria. The mystic challenge that's advocated by Prince Murgaputra's memory confounds any kind of pre-constructed landscape upon which a subject can come and act, but rather invites listeners into a taskscape that discloses meaning by decentering thought in tasks of listening, of observing, and feeling, entering a kind of liminal spaces of non-dual unknowing, of non-knowledge, and unselfing that put the sovereignty of the I think so central to Western modernity into questioning by deepening perception through a practice. The Jain tradition, along with so many Asian traditions, aim to exemplify often this non-dual challenge to the I think through countless tasks of experimental nonviolence and practice, toward often a multiplicity of beings. And those beings, of course, are constituted themselves of other epistemic and ontological modes of becoming. The Prince's investigation of memory offers a translational frame for ethical encounter, and that might be private, but it's also authoritative enough to counter dominant public narratives, much as we could think that this image right here throws a wrench into the primacy of a thinking subjective self as the most valid way to know and be in the world. Here we have an image of kind of a New York fashion designer who decided to become a Shvetambara nun. And right, some of this just throws, or often when I'm teaching students, right, it's often these sort of images, or this kind of thinking, this shifting of the self in relation to action and being and thinking in the world that seems to throw the biggest wrench into their engagement with the tradition. So my last thought here is that this mystic turn of unselfing recasts an important critique of human exceptionalism. Because even as Prince Murgaputra, right, in that text we read, he's recalling the previous rebirths as iron or fish. The Jain view unapologetically accepts that being born into the human birth state is the best and most desired karmic condition over any other birth form. To be born human is considered a rare opportunity to understand a complex living reality, to detach from passionate feelings and relationships, and to restrain one's actions for one's own benefit, as well as for others. So consequently, the Jain view claims that it's only from the human birth state, and for the Digambara sect, only the male human birth state, that one can attain liberation. So how can a tradition that advocates a praxis of radical nonviolence to other beings also preserve human exceptionalism? Is this baked-in anthropocentric privilege not a fatal blow to the consideration of any kind of multi-species solidarity that we've been thinking about today? Then I want to say not necessarily. Because to be human in the Jain view is understood to provide one the very best chance, but never the guarantee, to recognize and to experience through trying on and living out the fundamental truths of universal sentience, karmic difference, shared vulnerability to suffering, and the nonviolent imperative. But only to the degree that any human actually embodies these truths through praxis of carefulness, and not merely subject-object thinking about, will they karmically earn or fulfill their humanity. As Jain scholar Anne Vallely argues, human exceptionalism and reverence for all life are not antithetical in the Jain tradition, but they instead appear to work hand in glove. Solidarity with more than human others in Jain view, I think, is most dissonant and is most generative from contemporary debates within this hand-in-glove tension. On one hand, we have the shared jiv, which provides ontological equality among all living beings, such as those on your handout. But on the other hand, it's also understood that being born in the plant or animal realm results from karmic differences due to ignorance, carelessness, and violence in previous births. Though five-sensed animals, if you remember that manuscript image, in the Jain view, five-sense beings can act as moral agents. They can communicate about truths of reality, and they can even surpass the insights and virtue of people in many Jain stories. But these occurrences are also understood to be rare. Jain metaphysics privileges the human birth state because it's said to exceed certain limits of embodied plant and animal life. But as Vallely puts it, quote, human privilege is only established through a fraternal solidarity with other life, end quote. And it's this latter experience of solidarity that Prince Murgaputra had forgotten, and which was revived through his rebirth memories. And it's increasingly common today to see lay Jains, mostly, engage in tasks of care, education, eating, thinking about medication and health, walking, observing, and even engaging in complicated modes of social political interruption for animals and other beings. I suggest that human exceptionalism, when it's predicated on solidarity with, on behalf of, and as other beings, including these experiences of non-dual unselfing through mystic absorption or identity merger, however briefly experienced, can expand debates around multi-species solidarity toward options that exceed the I think of current subjective-object ethics, law, language, and political community that dominate modernity, towards something more perceptive, a more imaginative taskscape, where what is done to anything that exists also happens to us, and whatever beauty and thriving is safeguarded for others is also preserved within us. Thanks.
Thank you. Monitoring, because we, like, as I said to you, there are 45 people that are on webinar, so I'll be monitoring their questions here. Would you like to field their questions? Do you have any questions, comments, observations for Brianne? Jeff, please.
Yeah, so Brianne, this is going to come from left field. I guess I'm out left field. I work a lot with experiencers who have abduction experiences,
Yeah.
and they experience themselves as prey. Very much like this crocodile
Wow.
story. And I want to hear you talk about that phenomenon from a Jain perspective, which they don't have, by the way. They think of it in very Western, I think, agency kind of terms. And I just want to hear you talk. I don't have an agenda. I don't know what you're going to say. But how do we think about those kinds of human, those human experiences, which are actually quite common, but very much involve the human as some kind of object or some kind of, but the entity doesn't actually eat them, of course, but maybe it does. You know, there's a whole language around emotion and arousal and, you know, but there's a kind of feeding that goes on as well that people talk about.
No, I just want to make sure, I want to ask you a question. So you're referring to people who are having an experience of what?
Abduction.
Of abduction. Oh, okay. Right. And so that there is a kind of agential threat that is treating them as an object.
It's not their agency. That's why they call it abduction. It has nothing to do with human agency. They are the object of some other entity,
Yeah.
whatever that entity is.
Well, I mean, to me, that really resonates with Plumwood, right? When Plumwood is out there canoeing and says, you know, after all of her years working in ecological philosophy, ecological practices, realizing all of the different ways to generate respect for the living world, which often say, you know, that if we can bring, you know, we think of a circle of moral concern, right? And there's so many doors that we can use to bring bodies into the circle of moral concern. We've seen that even with people. There are many Homo sapiens who have never been considered quite human enough, right? And you have to create these doors of law and language and capacities and reason and logos and tool use, right? Each of these kind of bring them up to a fairly narrow understanding of the human. But and even today, when we think about the dominant fields of animal rights, these are often identity-based approaches which are trying to find some meaningful identity for the modern human world that is shared, that will allow them into the moral concern. So and again, imagine after a career in which Plumwood is advocating for this kind of concern through indigenous lifeways and through concept and language, all of this is on the table. But her experience was in fact the opposite. It was, I had a shocking reduction. It's not to bring the living world up. It's to have a shocking reduction of one's human exceptionalism, and that experience of destabilizing security, destabilizing the sense of self, exposing vulnerability, that this sinking in, which sounds like there's some parallels with an experience of being abducted, that this is an engine of ethical reflection that is perhaps more profound than anything that can be thought, because it has an exposure to it. It can't be unexperienced, right? For Plumwood, that changed the work that she did from then on out.
I have a question. I think it's very related to Jeff's question. So that kind of ontological, really life or death threat, and you have this moment that, oh, I am reduced to something else, something that, and I have no control over it. That kind of threat comes not only from other species, but from humans as well, right? Let's say there is a serial killer, and then we have to do something about that guy, because otherwise he's gonna kill. What can we do from, say, non-violence perspective? Or being gentle, try to develop solidarity with other species. What can we do about that serial killer?
Yeah. Oh, the serial killer question.
Yes.
I
You knew I was going to ask that, right?
I didn't, but now that you did, I should have. I actually want to say something first and then go to that particular question. I think where I think there's a meaningful point of overlap between Plumwood's shocking reduction and the Prince's shocking reduction to feeling like I was a bird, and it's so visceral, right? And I was sawn, and I was cut, and as a tree, I was, broke to bits. Yes, it's so visceral, and it's that shocking reduction. It's a human that never fully can be removed from the abject animal, right? Which is, I think, an important part even today as we think about animality and its relation to political human violence. But still to the first point, that oftentimes, having looked at nonviolence from a lot of different communities, especially Christian peace church traditions and the Jain tradition, one formative difference is that because the Jain metaphysical ontology even understands one-sense beings in earth, air, fire, water, and wind, and plants, there is a kind of attention to life that is difficult to see or hard to see. And there's an imagination space that, in the same way that a bird is vulnerable to us, that we are the serial killer, right? In so much of our life, just through inattention. And so that there is this flip of trying to say, even the very subtle forms of life, that there is an imaginative taskscape to enter into, that if you attend there, by the time you get to visible beings, by the time you get up to people, your propensity to harm is much more restrained. Whereas when I have looked at peace church traditions that begin with pacifism in the human community, it doesn't always trickle down, as trickle-down ideas rarely do. And so that's the first part of it. The second part is, I think there's also a really fundamental misunderstanding of nonviolence in the Jain tradition. When we understand that there is both a mendicant community and a lay community, we understand that there are different levels of practice, even among mendicants themselves. In the early texts, right up to the present, you see that there begins to be some leeway for more or less disciplined mendicants. That's even built into some of their structures, like the 14 stages of karmic shedding. There's sort of, taking a vow with carefulness, taking the great vows carelessly, right? And those are all mendicant roles. And then you've got lay practice. The Jain tradition is not a pacifist tradition. Historically, they have gravitated away from particular jobs of nonviolence, especially articulated in the medieval texts, but the ability to serve as a minority community within a dominant empire has allowed them to have a space for self-defense. There even, within the last couple of years, a very interesting set of images coming out of northern India of nuns being targeted through sexual harassment, learning how to defend themselves. And so I do think, there's this, nonviolence is a variable practice. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but it requires continuous attention, and it requires continuous reflection on the psychological elements of fear and anger and attachment passions that drive violence. And so in this case, there would be probably a strong analysis of someone such as a serial killer. We can even think of the Buddhist text of the serial killer Angulimala and how did the Buddha deal with him. But there isn't a requirement to only receive violence, though there could be a point when one has shed most of their karma that it could be more worthy for the sake of their jiv to not cause any harm at all to anyone anymore. It's a very rarefied state, but it's understood that one could do that in the furthest sides of karmic
Does that thinking come with responsibility for others too, for example? So let's say, I know this guy's gonna kill others, so I have to kill him in order to protect, in order to prevent him from causing a lot of harm to a lot of other people. Is that kind of thinking included? It's a kind of a responsibility, not just to protect me, but for others.
Well, so I would say, the answer that I would say will always have kind of multiple elements. I mean, I will try to think textually. I would think to possibly what a lay response might be, diverse, and then what a mendicant response would be. So I'm always trying to kind of, there's not one size of the Jain tradition, right? The texts are not univocal, the people are not univocal, the lay people are not univocal. But I would say what's interesting to that is when I studied with Anabaptist Mennonites, who were a peace church tradition, one of the books that they put out was, What Would You Do If? And it was because to a pacifist tradition, people are always like, well, what would you do if you could kill Hitler and save it? What would you do if you could, and if someone was going to kill your child? And you really get people trying to grapple with the dismissal, which is trying to look at the most extreme, when really what daily life is just the set of what we have. It's walking, it's talking, it's how the narratives of our own psyche, it's our own attachments. This is where we get the practice for the difficult extreme cases. And the extreme cases don't have there's no prescriptive ethic in nonviolence, which seems counterintuitive. But nonviolence is to say, one will have to be responsible for the action that they do. In the early Jain text, the Acharanga Sutra, we see threefold. I did it, I caused another to do it, I approved of another doing it, right? There's threefold. And then thought, speech, and mind. So it's a 3 times 3, right? In the sense that one recognizes both direct and indirect harms. I think I'm stepping slightly around your question.
No, but it's very, very.
When I think about, this might be slightly different, but for example, let's think about euthanizing animals, right?
Mhm.
Gandhi made a stir because he actually approved of the euthanasia of a dying calf. And many the Jains around would say that one should never cause the death of another. To cause the death of another brings the worst possible karma. And yet, for me, as a person who studied the Jain tradition, I am not a practicing Jain. I was raised in the woods of rural Michigan. I only encountered the Jain tradition at a community college, like one page, like, what is this? And I was hooked. But I have thought a lot about those kinds of costly choices. To euthanize a dog, to be angry politically. And I think what the Jain tradition says, you have to make all of your choices with your eyes wide open, right? Without the feeling that you're in always every way right. Right? That what you do has a cost. It's a cost to exist, and what we do has a cost. And one bears that cost, for better or for worse. And we don't have a single lifetime to get it right, in the Jain view, right? We have hundreds of lifetimes to strive. The early Jains were not called Jains, they were called Shramana, strivers.
So in your last question, you just mentioned kind of like the lack of a prescriptive ethic that's like, I guess, necessary. Earlier in your talk, you talked about how like what differs, I guess, in tradition with like Western and like modern modernity and like philosophy and whatnot is like human centrism. But I guess like the lack of a prescriptive ethic kind of suggests like a deeper like contradiction between philosophy, or I guess philosophy, yeah, it's not even a prescriptive ethic, but a philosophy with like Western modernity and Western traditions. And I wanted to ask, like, is that the case? And also, if it is the case, are there deeper contradictions between the two?
And the two are?
Jain traditions and Western modernity philosophy. I guess I think kind of more enlightenment and post-enlightenment and peace.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think to like realize that a word like, right, like the word self, what is it? That not all world visions, not all metaphysical soil produces the same flowers of the self, right? The self does not mean the same thing. And so when we think about, if you think about kind of the historical movement of liberalism to create the liberal human, that human, for a long time, excluded a lot of Homo sapiens. To be human often meant to sort of have a kind of Eurocentric appropriateness. Also, it meant to refuse the bestial. It meant to the brutal. It meant to refuse the animal, right? So that's where you get a kind of parallel of marginal people, marginal ecosystems, marginal animals, as all functioning within the same logic, right? They all are within the same kind of binary. If we have a binary, right, of human and animal, which one goes on top? Right? Human goes on top. If we have male and female, historically, right? If we have East and West, right, we get this sort of power hierarchy. But you can see that there are places and experiences throughout the world, even at the margins of Western thought as well, that try to challenge that sometimes. Maybe they put them more here, right, and say that there's something mutually requiring about them. You can't have one without the other. The dialectic is what makes any of it exist. And so I think we can see that the idea of the self, the idea of the human in the Jain view, is never as fixed. It's never as separate. It's never as permanent. It's never as substantive. It's always exposed. It's always caught into multiplicity. It's always vulnerable through karmic interaction of what it has been, what it's doing, what it will be, right? And so I think that some of these very basic terms that we take as a given when we understand the law, responsibility, liberal individualism, they really, we imagine that these are just facts. But in fact, we have to lift up the metaphysical rug and see, what are you smuggling in here, right? What does the self actually mean? How is the human defined? What are we taking for granted in just very common words? That we're reperforming a domination or a hierarchy again and again. The removal of the animal, the removal of the other, right? And I also just will say briefly, so do you have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say briefly, you said what about the mess of modernity? I put a couple of things up here, but what does it mean to be a Jain in the contemporary moment? Well, you have your, right, last year or 2 years ago, and almost every year, Jains are trying to, there's a kind of collision of Islam and Jains, Hindus and Jains in India, kind of grappling over ideological, metaphysical claims, but those are also mapping onto political issues, right? So that's more of a, how do you sort this out once you've got nation states and nationalism brought into there, right? It's one thing to have these ideas philosophically, it's another to say, well, what does it look like on the ground? So we kind of get into some messy territory that it's very hard to clean it up and have a pure place to stand.
I find myself being disturbed by something, in that when we're talking about the human self and the animal world and those dynamics, we haven't even been able to figure out the human self and the human self. The woman with the crocodile attack, in other contexts, where you live, what color your skin is, who you love. There are many places where I, as a black man, would be attacked by the crocodile. And it would not be shocking to me to think, oh my goodness, this crocodile doesn't think of me as completely human. There are humans that don't think of me as completely human. Regardless of who I am, what I've accomplished, I'm not thought of that way in certain situations or in certain places. We've got a lot of work to do. I completely agree with what you're saying, but there is so much other work just within the human species that has to be done that disturbs me greatly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I fully share that sentiment. But I think what we find is that it's not a all or nothing or a one or none perspective. I mean, if we think of the role of binary logic, right? If we've got black over white, which would be the normative and which is the less normative?
White.
So we can just kind of, and we can just do this all the way down. We can do God over what? Man, world, right? We've got man over, right? We've got kind of normative heterosexuality over, right? We've got kind of man over animal, right? All this logic is the same logic, right? It's to say that there is a defined norm and that there is something that's lacking, and once that lack has been defined, then every violation is justified. And so we can see, in fact, that homosexuality, animality, femininity, blackness, that these all are, that oftentimes they are of a piece. Why do we have ecofeminism? It's the recognition that the same structures that have been used to marginalize people's societies, civilizations, so to say, you even use the same language, right? If you want to emasculate someone to have power, you compare them to an animal or a woman, right? You call someone an animal, you call them a queer, right? Like these languages, they function on the same structure. To recognize the initial rejection of animality is, in many cases, the first and most. This is the linchpin that all these build upon. So really engaging animality, there's engaging animals, right? Today when we all leave, what do we do if there's an ant on the sidewalk? What do we do because this is not empty space? That's engaging living beings. But there's also engaging the question of animality. And that question is a critical question that if you want to look at any violence, it will function on a very it often will function on a very similar structure. And if you want to otherize it, you animalize it, right? And so we see that common logic. And I will just say something here. One time, actually this was in Houston, so all those who ever had me here, Anudeep, Jain Society, I went to Pathshala, which is like Sunday school for Jains. And I went to the preschool class. And when I got there, they had students sitting, young students, sitting, maybe 5 or 6. Some of them were the meditators. And their job was to sit there. And then the others were the disruptors. And their job was to be like, cause them trouble. These are just 5-year-olds, right? And so and then they had to switch. And then they ask them how they feel, right? It's like we have to practice for the difficulties of existence, right? And these children at 4 and 5 are practicing. At the end, they ask everyone, 5 years old, what happened this week that did you feel any anger this week? And one little boy, I will never forget, he was such a good teacher to me that day. He said, I was so mad this week. There were ants all over the patio and I wanted to kill them. And my mom said, we shouldn't kill them, live and let live. They have their own jeev. I wanted to, but then I didn't. And having spent so many years in human nonviolence theories that also they can't figure it out, right? Theories of nonviolence can't figure it out. They're complicated, and not all nonviolence is the same. Passive non-resistance is a form of nonviolence. Gandhi not eating, people not eating in a prison, that's a form of nonviolence. Those are not passive acts. They're all nonviolence. It's not just to say, like, run me over. Right? Nonviolence has a lot of elements in it. But they don't trickle out to strangers. They don't trickle out to animals. They don't trickle out to ecologies. When you have started at ants, right, by the time you get to a person, you have been engaging this, just as an outsider, anthropological perspective, seeing that flip is profound, I think.
It's very difficult, isn't it, though? Because, as you know, the Nazis, let's say, they loved their dogs.
Yeah.
But they lived on the same premise as concentration camp and daily industrial killing of humans is going on. So it's a very difficult challenge, isn't it? Of course, if we can all think about not harming anything, anybody, it's just the world is so filled with humans harming other humans, just so much of it, right? So it's a
Well, I think though one of the important elements of we see this especially in Buddhist thought and Jain thought, and they really engage in rhetorical debate. And we can find texts in which they're referring to each other, often in really negative ways, right? The Buddhist texts will really, toss the Jain sages under the bus. The Jain texts will throw the Buddhists under the bus. But they're really trying to work through the connection between mentality, emotionality, and practice. And what is the relation? And Buddhism will often emphasize that if you did not intend it, then the action is not karmically negative, even though they also, it's not one or the other. The Jains I'm talking about these sort of medieval arguments. The Jains would say it doesn't matter if you meant it, right? So action-centric, so material-centric. Karma is material in the Jain view. There's hardly any worldview that's more matter-focused, right? If you think it, it's materially affecting your karma. The psychology, the deep psychic assessment in some of these South Asian traditions, in terms of how we understand violence. It is not to say that you can control everyone else's, but that we at least have to begin to do the work ourselves to root out and to at least recognize our own fear, our own reactivity, our own greed, our own, the five poisons, the three poisons according to the Buddha. And that you think about just how this is not how the garden is tended, right? And so it's difficult to think about the role of the individual and the social without feeling like you're just individualistic and like if I just do this to myself, it's good enough. But somehow that is also part of what it is to facilitate flourishing and beauty in the world.
Any questions or comments? Well,
Thanks for
yes, one more.
I've got one more. All right, so you just mentioned that it's so action-centric that even having thoughts of harming can mess up the karma. So that makes me think of people who have been victims of great violence who may think of that even though they have no desire of enacting that violence. So does that, obviously we know it still affects them maybe physically and emotionally, right? That kind of stuff will always, if you're a victim of great violence, that's gonna stay with you. But does that affect their karma? I guess is my question.
Karma is so fascinating. In the Jain view, there's 145 kinds of karma. No one can really do justice to karma theory. There's only been one Jain scholar who's really tackled it. And then there's some mendicants who have, I think, spent generations of lineages, working out Jain karma theory. It can almost be absolutely confounding. So, but what I have found, at least when I have been doing ethnographic work, in Insistent Life, which is about bioethics, you ask Jains, we interviewed Jain medical professionals, lay Jain medical professionals, to explain how, let's say you've got someone who's unwell, right, with a disease, or they have a mental health issue, or they have been born with a disability, right? How is that understood? Is that all karma? Right? And of course, you've got some textual supports you can bring in, but you also see that there's an understanding that there's certain kinds of karmas that affect environment, there's certain kinds of karmas that affect the qualities of jiv, but there's also the karmas that you are susceptible to in your environment, that you don't have control over. And so there's a kind of, both in the text up through the medieval period, right up to the very present moment, where you see Jains kind of encountering new situations. And how do we explain this? And this adaptability, this reflexive adaptability, to say, our texts give us many insights, our mendicants give us many insights, but there's always this element of trust one's own, test it yourself, and to bring your own reason in the context together. And so there's a kind of element in which multiple karmas can be at play, and also there can be elements of environmental factors and that are outside of one's own karma, that are other people's fruits coming to play that are impacting others, right? We are not only actors, but we are also acted upon.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
So, are we gonna do this, Brianne?
What?
I'm gonna collect it, I'm kidding, but
Collect it, leave it to me, whatever you want, pass it to friends.
I just wanna thank Brianne, but also, because it was the first time I visited Jain Temple, was with Brianne, and then I learned so much about Jainism while Brianne was here. And the first time I visited Temple, I said, well, if only world leaders could learn from Jainism, right? I really want to reiterate this tonight, and I feel, especially time like this, when things are very uncertain. Yes, well, thank you for giving us a very profound way to look at the world and ourselves. Thank you, Brianne.